Hello again and welcome back to another video, and today we are looking at a scenario where all Slavic nations unite. This includes the Western Slavs of Poland, Czechia, and Slovakia, the Eastern Slavs of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and of course the Southern Slavs of Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Bosnia, and Slovenia. Immediately this would become the world's largest military and most likely the second most powerful. It would have a lot of the foods, oil, natural gas, and food exports, along with a rapidly growing economy and a massive population. They would also swiftly begin their first war against Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the three Baltic nations. This would not be very difficult, as they could within days capture Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, push along into eastern and northern Estonia, and begin a mass push towards the Latvian capital. Lithuania would actually be the first to capitulate, despite being arguably the strongest of the nations. The Latvian coast and the capital would be captured, causing them to be next, and the Estonians would not be far behind, surrendering on the exact same day, a mere couple of hours later. The Slavic Republic, not wanting to let any opportunity pass them by to secure control of the Baltic Sea, is going to annex all three of these nations, giving them some amount of autonomy, but no status beyond a part of their nation. They would then begin to demand territories from other nations. They would first make their most outrageous demand, which included the city of Istanbul and other territories out of Turkey, to give them easier access into the Mediterranean. Of course, Turkey denied this. They didn't think that Turkey would accept, but since Turkey is still fairly far away and a fairly powerful nation, they will not push on these demands. They also demanded the slight push of the Finnish border, along with Finnish demilitarization of the straits. Finland denies this, and in Finland, the Russians are more than confident enough to actually begin a war over these lands they have just demanded. They quickly declare war on Finland after the demands are not reached, and it would not take too long before the Slavs are right outside of Helsinki. They would also begin a mass push into the north, hoping to distract Finnish forces, but mass Finnish guerrilla fighting would take place, slowing down the Slavs very much. The Russians would of course be doing the bulk of the work, but certain powerful economies and military such as Poland, Serbia, Croatia, Czechia, and especially Ukraine would also be helping out massively. They would soon cut Finland into two and then reprioritize the south, capturing most populated regions. And although most people in Finland are still fully willing to fight and want to, the government would officially surrender, and the Russians would push their border even further than originally stipulated in their previous agreement. They would annex multiple Finnish Baltic ports and a slight amount of southern Finland, but especially the entire Finnish north, hoping to threaten Sweden and Norway into some form of submission or non-aggression pact, basically trying to force them into the neutrality that they had done to Finland for years. No, not the Soviets. The new Slavic nation would also set up a puppet regime in Finland. To secure their dominance without having to directly occupy all of that land. They would then begin a few smaller invasions into the Balkans, annexing Kosovo and Albania. At this point, though, the West has had enough, and although I dismantled any existing alliances to begin this video, a new one would pop up in a NATO-style form, being led by the Americans, of course, being formed in a similar way NATO was between the Americans, the Canadians, the British, and the French. Within a week, though, the Benelux and Germany would also join, along with Denmark, who was being very highly pressured by this new Slavic state. Realizing that their influence was being challenged and that they might not be able to expand for much longer, they begin a mass war against Moldova, Romania, and Hungary. Along with that, they begin a separate campaign into Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. These two campaigns would lead this mass rush of Slavic expansion. They would quickly push down the Romanian coast, capturing the capital and a lot of the south. Pushing down the Danube, they would capture Budapest and practically capitulate Hungary. And they would also start a slight push along the Georgian coastline and managing to capture Baku, the largest and most important city of Azerbaijan. Soon enough, they would continue their push into southern Romania, hoping to capitulate the nation. And with Moldova being irrelevant and the Hungarians having their industry and morale crushed, all three of these nations would capitulate. Surprisingly enough, in the Caucasus Mountain nations, the Slavs would be struggling even more, as they're dealing with many mountains and more tough terrain than they did have to go up against the Transylvanian mountains, but they were able to push along and with the Danube, and the Transylvanians didn't really stop them from pushing along the Romanian coast and into southern Romania. From here, Tbilisi would fall, and both Azerbaijan and Georgia would surrender, leaving just Armenia, who would really not stand a chance, as the Slavs would crush them until eventually they capitulated. The Slavic nation would annex Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, whilst taking multiple regions out of the other three conquered nations. Romania might be the one who's being punished the most, as their entire coastline and multiple other territories would be stripped away from them immediately in the first article of the peace treaty. Along with this, a piece of northern Hungary and especially northern Romania would also be taken, along with the same exact territory but in the south. This would be so that if in a future rebellion they decided to team up against their Slavic overlords, the Slavic nation could quickly push down and cut the two off. We also see that although Romania is allowed to unite with a much smaller Moldova, the Hungarians are given a border strip from the Romanians. This would lead to mass Slavic dominance in the entire Balkan region, as it has practically just been transferred to them on a silver platter. Along with this, their influence in the Middle East vastly expands, as now controlling southern Romanian and Azeri oil. They are one of the largest exporters in the world. They are funding Europe, and although Europe does want to stop them, they're struggling to completely cut off Russia from their imports. We also see that the US and their allies begin a mass invitation campaign into their alliance, as the so-called Mediterranean section will be created with the joining of Italy, Spain, Turkey, Greece, and Portugal. Along with this, Norway and Sweden would both join in the Nordic campaign. This would practically cut off the Russians from Europe, as although Austria is not directly in the faction, they are being guaranteed by the Americans, the French, the British, the Italians, the Germans, and surprisingly enough, the Luxembourgish, and of course the Slavic nation, not wanting to have to go to war with the powerful nation of Luxembourg, and whatever other minor nations are guaranteeing them, will not be attacking any further west. Instead, they will be striking down further into Asia. They see this as their easiest form of expansion, and the easiest place to increase their influence until eventually they can make themselves so powerful to the point where the West cannot lose them, or else the global economy as a whole would struggle. This is already very, very painful for the West, as they have lost many allies and much strength, as the Russians aren't exactly excited to work with them either. The Slavic nation, which is technically being led by the Russians, but is still technically a different country, it's not just Russia that annexed them, is going to invade the entirety of the Middle East. Along with this, they're going to occupy all of Mongolia, as Mongolia doesn't even resist. At this point, they know they cannot win, and they will simply give in to Slavic ambitions. The Chinese attempt to protest this, cutting off many more relations with the Slavs that were considered necessary, but at this point, the Slavic nation has expanded to such a point where they are almost fully self-sufficient. Although not quite yet are they completely there. Soon enough they may be, though, as the Central Asian campaign is going very well. Northern Kazakhstan has completely fallen within a month, and the Caspian Sea is almost entirely under their control. This is by far their biggest blitz maneuver yet, and it is just going to continue, as much of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan falls, whilst the rest of northern Kazakhstan fully capitulates. With this, the entire nation of Kazakhstan capitulates, with only some Uzbeki and Kyrgyzstani troops being able to arrive and save a small portion of the south. At this point, the Uzbekis are struggling themselves, though, and as Turkmenistan decides to surrender not to lose any more lands, the strongest nation left, Uzbekistan, who was mainly carrying this new war effort, falls, and the last two minor nations are really no real issue. Instead of setting up any client states, the Slavic nation will merely annex these territories, stating basically that they have been turned and that they need to be reincorporated and taken over. This is going to further harm relations with the Chinese, as the Chinese and the Slavs now have one of the largest borders in the world, with Russia annexing Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Mongolia. Although at this point, the Slavs have been mostly stopped. I have to stop saying Russian. They have pushed into Central Asia and Eastern Europe as much as they can, and they are quickly being stopped by resistance on both sides, with the Chinese putting an absolute foot down in their east, and the USA and their faction putting foot down in the west. This leaves just one area of expansion down into Iran and Afghanistan, along with Iraq in the Middle Eastern campaign. Arabia decides to form up their own faction, with Saudi Arabia basically invading many of their neighbors, interfering in Yemen and securing the nation, interfering in Syria and securing the nation as a puppet state. With that, they would also create a personal union with the Jordanians. Is that what you'd call them, Jordanians? I don't really know. And annexing Syria into the Greater Arabian State. This state would create an alliance with the rest of the Arabian states in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, along with Lebanon. And that would put a stop to Russian ambitions in the south, as although the Slavs could most likely win that fight, the Slavs will most likely win that war in the end. Pushing through the desert would be very unnecessary, and the Middle East, aka Arabia, is now moving in closer and closer to the West and China, trying to get guarantees from both sides. Russia, though, does see the opportunity to push into Iran and Afghanistan, and they will take that, as they may not get this opportunity again. They swiftly begin a push into northern Iraq and especially into Afghanistan, which they hope to secure quickly before any kind of guerrilla campaigns can be fully prepared. The north falls, but the south in the desert keeps on fighting. They then decide to focus on the Iranian coastline, which goes the Arabian Caspian coast, which goes very, very well, capturing much of the north of Iran, which is some of the most populated and important regions. They then decide to push down along through Mesopotamia into Iraq, following the Tigris. They would follow it until they reach the coast, practically capitulating Iraq and setting up a massive border with Iran that they just cannot cover. At this point, Arabia would join in on their own and begin an invasion through Iraq into Iran, occupying some of the territories that the Slavs had occupied recently. They would also continue to bash their heads to Afghanistan, and despite facing 3 or 4 to 1 casualties against them, they would continue to push until eventually all of their enemies would be forced into surrender. This would lead to their final major expansion, as they annex all of northern Iran and whatever is left of what can be considered Central Asia and a large part of Afghanistan. This may be unstable, but hey, why not make it even more realistic? There's no way this happens to begin with. And now they are an even larger power on the world stage. Annexing these territories, we can look over the statistics one more time. I cannot give you exact things because I'm not going to spend 10 years punching things into a calculator just to forget, but some rough estimates would include this, of course, being the largest country in the world. If we go ahead and put it over the United States of America, it is not even close. They absolutely dwarf any other country you could possibly think of, being most likely the largest nation in all of human history. They might still be slightly behind the British Empire, but if they are, it is slightly. They would also they would also divide their new puppets into two sections. The Iraqi section, which would be expanded to Iran, and the Iranian section, which would be expanded into Afghanistan whilst losing lands to Iraq. They would lose overall, as the lands they have given up are far more important than the lands they have gained, but they can't really do anything about it. Soon enough, Arabia might finish uniting, but I doubt that the Slavic nation can push much farther than this. They are now rivaling the Americans, and they do not really need very many friends as they have one. I do not know what would happen after this. They are still not almighty. They may capitulate. They have many ethnicities. They are incredibly unstable. But either way, I do hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.